Hi, this is Paul. Sorry for the low volume on the Emergent video. I had to edit, which I hate, but I did it, and the volume is better. Let me know if the volume is better. It should be better. I also uploaded a new YouTube. You can't really take something down and substitute it or substitute the file. You have to just upload a new, so there's a second version of it. I kept the old one. I just put a comment on it, and all the old comments are in there, so I know 100 and some of you don't like losing your comments, so they're all there, even if YouTube disappears them. But I want to talk a little bit about the CRC Voices video that we did. We talked about it at our cluster meeting once a month. Myself and the other CRC pastors in our Sacramento cluster get together and have lunch and talk about stuff. And this came up, what came up about this video, it's been quite something that we've been chewing on CRC Voices in a lot of different ways. But also what came up is, I think that the main thing that I saw in the video, which I tried to communicate in the title, is that the boomers were basically felt themselves to be liberationists. So if you think about this in sort of a generational way, you have a generation that go and survive this depression and fight the Second World War. And after the Second World War, you have an unprecedented economic situation in the United States where suddenly you're going to have this massive economic boom. This entire war industry is now transferred to consumer goods, which are going to be spread around the world to the rest of the world that's sort of trying to develop and rebuild after the war. You have people who've been traumatized by the war, but you don't really have a lot of knowledge about trauma. And so all they want to do is settle down. Read Unbroken, not the movie, read the book. And you really get a sense of, after all the trauma in the war, they just want to settle down. And some people just started settled down to drink. Other people, they just want to settle down. They want to have stability. They want to have a job for the rest of their life. They want to have a good pension. They want to have a suburban home. They want to have a family. And they just settle in and they want to have everything just fixed. Now, their children, who are the boomers, are the ones that by the 1960s take some of this stuff that's in the culture in the 50s, and in the 60s you have this counterculture, and it's a revolt against the man. It's a revolt against the stability. It's a revolt against all of this stuff. And they want to break free and cut loose. And Pete Van de Beek, who's up there in the corner, I'm going to play a clip from the video. There's so many worthy clips in this video. It was such a good conversation. Pete Van de Beek basically tells the story of growing up as an immigrant kid in Canada. Now, Pete, I've been talking to all of these guys for a long time on CRC Voices, the most recent entry, but the rest of the guys, I've been talking to these guys for a lot of years. And Pete and I have often talked about what trauma did, especially to the Canadian CRC, because these people left war-torn Netherlands, and I heard stories from my grandparents of just the way people were. So my grandfather took a church up in Canada because my grandfather had the softest heart you could ever believe. And you have these refugees coming from the Netherlands. He was fluent in Frisian and Dutch and English. And so he went up there and he served the church in Owen Sound. Not a terribly dynamic preacher, but people knew that he loved him. And there's some really lovely things written about my grandfather from that period. My father had already started college, so my father didn't migrate up to Canada, but my aunt and my uncle and my grandparents did. And some of the stories that my grandmother had from that Canadian church were pretty brutal, and how the people treated each other. Now, looking back, you would say, well, these people are traumatized from the war. But there was no language like that, and everybody's just trying to survive. And so Pete tells the story here of, growing up with all of these rules and so what you get in the baby boom generation are these liberationists. What the gospel is liberation. Now, for the generation that survived the war and survived the depression, the gospel was rigor, discipline, save your money, build your institutions, build your community strong, rely on one another. Don't be individual. Individual people die. Be communal, because then maybe you can survive the difficulties of after the crash in the 20s and the 30s and the 40s. This builder generation, they built because their life depended on it. And their children were liberated, and they were liberated. But then, after the liberationist generation, Some of the people who grew up in the biggest chaos after after that generation, where there weren't any norms. I remember this one Emergent book that I read, and for a long time, I might still have it. So it wasn't very long after I'd come to Sacramento, and you could see that the seeker movement is dying, and the emergent movement is just starting to take off. And I remember I grabbed a quote out of one of these books, and I could probably find the book. I bought a bunch of books by this author, and he says, basically, in the 21st century, duty motivates nothing. Joy motivates everything. Now, a boomer wrote that. And the boomers just assumed that their kids would just go on liberating. And in many ways, that's exactly what happened in the church. And when you look at the fight in the Christian Reformed Church about, basically the boomers versus the millennials, and again, the children of many of these boomers just kept liberating. But it's often children of much more chaos in the world that joined the Christian Reformed Church and said, well, the gospel is not liberation, the gospel is rigor. And in the Christian Reformed Church, a fair amount of young, restless, and reformed rigor. And so you see this tick-tock, tick-tock, tick-tock intergenerational thing going. And as I'm the oldest guy in the cluster, no, Kevin Adams is older than I am. But after Kevin Adams, I'm the oldest guy in the cluster. And so our millennials, who are now beginning to realize that their kids are in college and they're not so young anymore, and they're like, I see this bunch of boomers on the screen, and they were just surprised at listening to the boomers continue to work through their experience young. Now, Mo is such an important part of this conversation. Again, some people are commenting, why aren't there any women? Hey, I posted the link to CRC Voices. I said, any of you want to jump in, grab a link. And the days went by and nobody took a slot. And then suddenly they were filled. And these are all, Mo's the most recent edition, of course, but these are all long-term people in the forum. And most of them are boomers. And to listen to them talk about this. But then the reaction in the live stream was fascinating. Sam said it very well. He mentioned, but what if you didn't grow up with this stuff? Of course, Sam, transfigured, is a child of someone who came to Jesus in the Jesus movement and in the charismatic movement. And then this Zizek video on Twitter is going around.
Imagine you are a small girl or boy of, let's say, 8 years. It's Sunday afternoon, and your father wants you to visit your old grandmother. Then, if you have an old authoritarian father, he will tell you, listen, I don't care how you feel. Just do your duty. Go to your grandmother and behave there properly. That's perfect, I claim. Because you will retain your, let's call it inner freedom. You will be furious at your father. But that's good for your long-term freedom and so on. Now, what would a monster called postmodern permissive father do? He would not give you an order, but he would have told you something like this. You only go to visit your grandmother if you really want it. Just remember how much your grandmother loves you. Now, a child is not an idiot, and he or she will know perfectly what this order means. Beneath the appearance of a free choice, it gives you a much harsher order. The order is not only you must go and visit your grandmother, but you must do it freely. You must really wish to visit your grandmother. So you see this nice example of where the apparent freedom of choice masks a much harsher choice.
Now, what's interesting there is that any of you who've been watching my Rough Drafts for Sunday know that the standard ending of a sermon is misery, deliverance, gratitude. Misery, deliverance, gratitude. It comes from the Heidelberg Catechism. That's directly connected with what he says there. But what do we do with duty? What do you do with duty in terms of formation? So the boomers are basically saying, and in the CRC, we had this interesting conversation about Sabbatarianism in our cluster, because for many of us, as was highlighted in the video, Sabbatarianism, meaning observance of the Sabbath, of the Sunday, the special rules in the CRC about the Sunday. Sabbatarianism was a very big deal, and we were raised in it. And then suddenly we look at the people who are still observing the Sabbath in this Christian Reformed way. Of course, the Jews will look at us and say, "What are you doing? First of all, it's the wrong day, and then you're doing it in this weird way." Hey, but religious silos are religious silos. And so then in the 70s and 80s and 90s, there was this big liberation from the Sabbatarianism. There's a liberation from the Christian schools. There's a liberation from all of these things. And then now you have this movement in the CRC of young pastors, many of them coming in to the denomination, not from homes that had all of this order, all of this duty, all of this authority, that are like, this is what we need. We need a lot more of this. You boomers who are, your boomerality, your freedom of choice, all this stuff that you're doing, you're destroying the world. What we need is rigor. What we need is authority and consequences and responsibility and accountability. And once you get this, now, boy, what a class we have going. And you can take this culture of sincerity, which is basically fulfilling inherited values, versus culture of authenticity, which is sort of the secret, sacred self expressing itself. You look at these two groups. I mean, how many movies, you can look at Footloose, how many movies, this is the theme. This has been the theme of, I can't tell you how many coming of age movies for 40 years, 50 years, 60 years of religious indoctrination by Hollywood is liberationist. Daddy, the color purple. I mean, liberationist on just about every front, till it hits a point culturally where everybody's like, wait, we've been liberating ourselves into nothingness. People need to get married. People need to have children. People need to hold down jobs. People need to, and especially if you have an affluent society where, do you really need to? You can kind of get by and mama's money and the government dole and blah, 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 blah. Well, that's pretty much where we're at. And, it was interesting because, Richard Rowland says, duty is a very underrated motivation. And then I believe he himself retweeted duty is a very underrated motivation. Yeah, but it's also a very complex motivation. And this is where, again, you can sort of cross Peterson's voluntarism, because of course Peterson in his themes keeps mentioning, okay, it's got to be voluntary, can't be tyranny. But of course, Peterson is pretty much exactly my age. And it's very interesting, this dance that Peterson is doing in terms of duty, because he's this voice of duty. But, in his Exodus series, he's talking about voluntary. It's got to be voluntary. If it's voluntary, then it's going to be meaningful. If it's externally imposed, then it's going to be tyranny. And then, of course, you have the whole child development thing, which is, train up a child in the way he or she should go and instill that order within them. And of course, my mother actually wasn't a boomer. My mother was just at the end of the builder generation. And at the end of the builder generation, she was a strict mother. My wife was a strict mother. My children are blessed because they were strict mothers. But again, you want to have a strict mother, but you also want to have a loving mother. You got to have a fear of your mother, but you've also got to have a deep down knowledge that all of the discipline she's given you is because she really loves you. Because if you get that discipline, but you don't have the sense of love, then it's just tyranny. And if you get the love, but you don't have that discipline, well, then you're going to have to learn stuff a little bit later in life. So it's a tricky dance that goes on with this, and it's very tricky theologically. And the Christian Reformed Church is going to continue to have a very interesting theological conversation, and I think a very interesting conversation about practice. But The truth is that most of this practice is not governed by the church. Most of this practice is simply instilled by the society. And most of the formation is coming from the society. I had tweets. Where are we going here? I should probably post the better. That was just talking about thumbnails. Christian YouTube. Anyway, I'm going to put that clip from the Friday live stream here. I'll put a link to the entire conversation. If you're up for 3 hours, you can listen to the whole thing. If you're interested in the Christian Reformed Church, it might be worth your time, because these all are Bill Viss, Len Vandezee. I mean, Bill and Len are two of the most important leaders that the CRC's had over this last generation. They're both retired. They're both getting up there in years now. But they're vitally important leaders. And, Bill Viss, not quite as visible, but Len Vandezee deeply shaped the CRC over the last 50 years. And in crucially important ways, and I think in great ways. Now, Len and I differ on a bunch of things, but I have a world of esteem for Len. And, yeah, so there's that. Leave a comment.
So true.
People who feel comfortable living in gray areas are often people who are in the minority. They're in the minority, so they might say, "Yeah, I would like to be in a gray area because most people think differently than me. So let's expand our horizons." But I would say in just about any denomination, there's going to be some black and white. There's going to be some basic beliefs, a belief that you're not prejudice against people because of their race, or a belief that you abide by the rule of law. There's certain real basic beliefs that I think just about any church has, even churches that think that they accept a lot of gray areas. And the churches that really, really are heavily into the gray areas, maybe churches that don't believe anything in particular, and they don't really survive very long.
I don't know. So let me give you a synopsis of my upbringing, which has created where I am now. So I grew up in an immigrant CRC in Canada, where there was a lot of black and white, and Catholics were going to hell. If you rode your bike on Sunday or went swimming, of all things. This was a severe problem. And so one day I got to really start a notepad and make a list of all these things. So there were so many of these. And then as life goes on, they start falling away. And you hear a good sermon on the Sabbath was made for man and man was not made for the Sabbath, or something like that, which shifts your thinking about Sabbatarianism, or at least the way it was lived out in my community. And so a lot of my generation, I believe, and that would be the boomers in Canada, grew up having all these black and whites fall away and not sure what was left, what there was to stand on. And the matter of, and at least for me, I'm more comfortable with that now. For many years, it was a searching process of, okay, what is there to stand on? And similar to what you pointed to, Mo, is like then going out and adventuring into swimming on Sunday just to see if lightning would strike, right? Or having an opportunity to engage someone a little more deeply who's of a different culture than myself, and make a connection in that. My last one in my group,
but did they just replace? Oh, go ahead, Pete.
Was a Russian.
But did you just replace that, or did a lot of people just replace that with other black and whites, like the black and white being that people who won't swim on Sunday are kind of stupid, or that it's really wrong to go against some of the more liberal norms in the culture?
It's a danger, yeah. But I mean, that's not how I would put it if pressed a little bit. So for some people, it's important to their religious faith to not swim on Sunday. That's what they need to do. but it's not a prohibition that prevents me from having intimacy with God.
Well, another aspect of it is, you talked about like the Sabbath and then allowing it to fall away. And to a certain degree, I think that is the wrong progression, is that it doesn't fall away, is that you realize that there is a higher value. So the Sabbath is valuable, but there's a higher value that can be sacrificed for, or for which that can be sacrificed, if I want to please the English teachers. So it's like, you have to learn to revere the Sabbath. You have to learn that. That's something that I didn't learn growing up. I learned more as an adult. But then once you learn it, then you can sacrifice it for the good of the kingdom of God. It's like the treasure, the crowns that you'll be given that you throw at the feet of Christ. It's not that the Sabbath isn't the crown. It's not that it's meaningless. It's that it has a certain meaning. And once you've grasped that meaning, you can play with it. And ideally, you play with it in such a way that it edifies the body.
Yeah.
I didn't quite track with all of that, Mo. Sorry.
All you provocateurs can't understand each other.
Paul goes and puts a comment on the screen, and I was lost. And it had my name in it, so I thought I had to read it, and so I missed.
Yeah, don't look at the chat if you're over a certain age. If you're retired, don't look at it.
Yeah,
Mo and I are the only ones that can follow.
So, like for me now, Sabbath is about me letting go of saving myself, and I do it all week long. It's not on a particular day, and a secondary part of that is letting go of obeying either the cultural norms of my Christianity or the Ten Commandments. What I mean by letting go is not deliberately violate them, but be less conscious of them as a means to contribute to my salvation or my relationship with God. And that, when I learned that, or when I began to practice it that way, was immensely freeing. So I know you were talking about sacrificing things. And so I sacrificed those practices that I grew up with on this new altar of this new understanding, is what I think. I think that applies to what you said, Mo.
Well, I'm more where Mo was at on that one. I think that every aspect of our Christian faith, Sabbath, whatever it is, has a kernel of deep importance that we need to dig out and to understand and to grasp, rather than to say, well, I'm done with that. I think you, Pete, I don't know to what extent you meant this, but you say, yeah, I'm done with the Ten Commandments because, and I'm assuming, I'll put some words in your mouth, because they are telling me that I have to do certain things in order to be saved, or I have to do certain things in order to be loved. And if that's the level at which you understand the Ten Commandments, you're not understanding them. Would be my thing. They are, the Ten Commandments say, this is the way that God has ordered life in society, and if you don't live it out this way, if you violate other people, whether that's taking their lives or taking their dignity or whatever it is, then you're living contrary to the fabric of life that God has created, the love that God has created. And you can say that about any of the commandments. If you are a workaholic, and if you think that your life is going to be founded upon your ability to build something or to have a certain level of income or whatever, you're violating the Sabbath. You don't understand your freedom then. So yeah, every one of those commandments to me has a deep, abiding meaning, and I would say that about, in effect, anything in the Old Testament. Part of what I've learned from the early church fathers is that distinction that is made through the Reformation of grace or works is really bad. That we are created to be different people, and we are created to live different lives, and we got to pay attention to that. We are created to be new people in Jesus Christ, and this typical sort of evangelical thing, well, you believe in Jesus Christ and you're saved, is nonsense. Absolute nonsense, because it's not in the Bible and it's not in the early church, and it's destructive of Christianity. Oh, I had my rant there.
But what you say, Len, is close to what my experience is, but I haven't practiced articulating it. So, but what I believe is the case, I'm not good at practicing it, is that if I let go of the 10 Commandments and hand over my life to the Holy Spirit, I will live by what the 10 Commandments say without intentionality, almost by accident. So some of the more amazing, positive, God-oriented spiritual experiences I've had have been when I'm not thinking about keeping the law, or even what the 10 Commandments might say about this particular situation. So when you say the grace thing, when we let grace into our life, what was the opposite of it? You had two things: grace and
law. Yeah.
Law, right? So when we let grace take over, law becomes less important, and we actually image God better if we are working on keeping intimate relationship with God. I was going to do a little thing on Genesis, because I think Genesis 1 is all about God trying to establish intimacy and us breaking. So anyway, that we could do pitches in the next one of these on that topic and into it more. But
Jesus had a little commentary on the 10 Commandments called the Sermon on the Mount.
Right.
And most Christians that I know of struggle to pay attention to that, to what he said, and to carry it out in their lives.
Yes. Well, I think the 10 Commandments is like Music Theory 101. Sermon on the Mount is Theory 201. But rare is the person that can understand, like, Pete, what you're saying is now you're trying to live with intimacy with God. I don't think you could do that if you hadn't, for a large part of your life, had the 10 Commandments front and center. This is I will hide your law in my heart and dwell upon it daily. It's like you want to get to the point where you're not consciously doing it. I mean, it's kind of like the flow in jazz when you're improvising. It's you've practiced these scales and these patterns so often that when you get into that moment in front of people, you just go with what you're feeling. But you can't get there if you haven't practiced those scales and all those things.
I'm good with that, 10,000 hours and all. And in fact, my wife and I were talking about this last night, and I was trying to tell her that I was going to be part of this. And she walked into the room one time when I was watching a video of Paul and John the first time they went to Europe, and they talked about that it was raining for 10 minutes. So she thinks that's all this is about. So I was trying to explain. And she asked, "Are you going to talk about rain?" But she used the analogy of a leash for what I think Mo is trying to say here, is that the basics, Music 101, is essential. The leash needs to be on you for a while for you to understand what the entity on the end of the leash is trying to have you accomplish. I use training wheels as well. So, but the thing is that people that still depend on training wheels are shocked when you take yours off.
Sam, our universalist, I always call him a universalist. He isn't. He's a Unitarian. Sam, our Unitarian, our biblical Unitarian, says, now to criticize the millennials, none of us really know what it's like to grow up in a church environment like Pete just described. That's Pete when you were describing growing up. And I think to part of our conversation, Pete, with your pitch is we obviously, as human beings, and especially now as individualists, we tend to focus on the narrow span of our one little life. And what we are actually seeing is this multi-generational handoff where we're sort of, it's sort of a degree of opponent processing. We're always trying to recalibrate between sort of the libertarian and the legalist. And we're going back and forth. And, you know, Pete grew up in a community that perhaps was too tight, but Pete was able to internalize that and say, I understand Sabbath and can apply it in my life regardless of what day of the week it is. Right. And we have a generation that comes and says, I have, and then it was funny because D-Dod's comment was, meanwhile, everyone has to work on Sunday. In other words, another generation says, you talk about Sabbath, I have no idea what you're talking about because everything's going 7 days a week. Those New Jersey Sunday Blue laws that were, again, civilizational Christianity in New Jersey, right, suddenly those go away. And so we begin to see this, and one could make an argument with respect to same-sex marriage that perhaps the right locus of analysis is not on one lifetime, but on 200 years of same-sex marriage. What do 200 years of same-sex marriage actually accomplish? And then the question is, well, on what frame of reference should we be calibrating our norms as a society? Because over long periods of time, we know that norms can have cumulative effects one way or another. We see that by virtue of different cultures.
Still I have it. There are moments I conveniently forget that I'm a 40-year-old man. The last vestiges of a ghost long dead. A ghost with a messiah complex. A messiah too lazy to rise or ascend. Happily hurt and hard. A hanger-on or haunting of a time past. A heroic dream of the harrowing of hell. Failure to launch. Cling to a life vest. Treading in spells that linger and last. Mom and Dad, righteous and mad, daydreamers with ghosts of their own. My memory of them stoic, looking with aims to pretend. Always on the brink of somewhere. Each a child dancing on the fence. On down the river. Dreamt in the sunshine. Saturday morning cartoons, the only Sabbath I knew. A disciple of Jim Henson and John Hughes. Worship in cathedrals where the Toys R Us. Baptized in ball pits. A clown served the sacrament we eat. More Pepsi and Pizza Hut. Say please. Say cheese. Between Kurt Cobain, a scrambled cable screen, towers tumbling, Super Bowls, and reality TV, the ghost is constitutionally unwilling and intrinsically unable to see and be seen, searching madly for attention to seek. But you could be anything. Never say never. If you've got nothing nice to say, don't say nothing, ever. Don't talk to strangers, see what I say, just do it. You don't listen very well, do you? You don't do very well, do you? You're not looking too good, are you? Keep up. Appearances aren't what they seem. Will you ever grow up? You look like you're stuck. I think you took too much. Echoes the ghost within the host who prays the dead bury their dead and stay buried.